In the harsh winds of Montana, 1883, a broken woman collapses, beaten, starving, her children stolen. A cowboy's steady hand lifts her from despair. Will she reclaim her family and find love again? Dive into this gripping Western tale on Western Frontier Heartstrings. Subscribe now to fuel more heartfelt stories. The wind cut hard through the valley, stinging with dust and the faint, bitter scent of sagebrush crushed underfoot. It carried the memory of winter, sharp and unyielding, when she staggered off the train and collapsed face-first onto the cracked wooden platform of the Red Rock station. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her lip was split, one eye nearly swollen shut, her dress torn at the hem, its faded calico pattern streaked with mud. Her boots, once sturdy, were scuffed to ruin, the leather cracked like the dry creek beds beyond the town. But it was the way her hands trembled, clutching a worn shawl too thin for the season, that made the station master step back. She looked like a woman who had run from hell. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice cautious, his fingers twitching toward his hat. She did not answer. Her knees buckled, and she dropped, just like that, too bruised to stand. It was the cowboy who caught her. Yates O'Connor had been leaning against a weathered fence rail, his hat tipped low, waiting on a shipment of barbed wire coiled in heavy spools. He saw her fall before anyone else moved. In 2 long strides, he was there, dropping to his knees beside her. He slid his arm under her back, lifting her like she weighed nothing more than a feather caught in a breeze. Her head slumped against his chest, her breath shallow, her skin pale beneath a mask of dirt and bruises, but she was breathing. "Where's the doctor?" Yates barked toward the station master, his voice rough but steady. "Town's 4 miles off. Closest doc is out there. I'll take her." Yates did not ask permission. He carried her to his buckskin mare, her mane flecked with dust from the trail. He nestled her carefully in front of his saddle, her body limp against the worn leather, and rode hard toward town, the horizon smudged with the promise of dusk. Her dress was soaked with sweat and dirt, the fabric clinging to her too thin frame. Her wrists were marked with bruises, dark and splotched, that told a story no one should ever have to live through. She woke once on the ride, just long enough to flinch when his arm shifted too close. "Easy," he said, his voice soft as the creak of the saddle. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her good eye catching the fading light, and then fell back into whatever place she had gone to survive. They reached Dr. Keller's clinic by dusk, the small building sagging under a tin roof that rattled in the wind. The old man took one look at her and waved Yates in. "Lay her on the cot. I'll get what I need." Yates laid her down, brushing a stray strand of matted hair from her cheek, the gesture brief but careful. He stepped back but did not leave. He stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching as the doctor worked. It took hours before Keller finally said, "She'll live. But she needs rest, food, time." "What happened to her?" Yates asked, his voice low. The doctor shook his head, his hands stained with iodine. "That's for her to say." Yates stayed the night in the chair by her bed, its wooden slats creaking under his weight. He did not know why, not yet. Something about the way she had collapsed without a sound, like she had been holding on with everything and finally let go, stayed with him. She woke the next morning, blinking against the pale light filtering through a muslin curtain. He was there, sitting beside her with a tin of hot tea in his hand, the steam curling in the cool air. "Morning," he said. She tensed, her fingers gripping the edge of the quilt. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added. Her eyes flicked to the door, then to the window, calculating escape. "My name's Yates. Yates O'Connor. I run a cattle outfit west of here." She said nothing. "You got a name?" She stared at her hands, the nails chipped and dirt-stained, then finally rasped, "Kala. Kala Zane." He nodded. "You hungry, Kala Zane?" Her eyes filled. She nodded once. He stood. "Then let's get you fed." The days passed slow. Kala did not speak much. She never let anyone but Yates near, not even the doctor. She never asked why he stayed. He just kept showing up, every morning, bringing her something warm to eat, oatmeal flecked with dried apples, or broth thickened with barley. He sat by her while she sipped, saying little but steady, like the mountains outside the window, their peaks dusted with early snow. One day, she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was barely audible, like a leaf skittering across the ground. He looked over. "You don't owe me anything." She looked away. "I didn't think anyone would help me." He did not ask what she had run from, not yet. But the bruises were fading now, and she was sitting up more, her eyes regaining a faint spark of color, like the green of river moss. It was on the 5th day that she broke. "I had 2 children," she said suddenly, her eyes glassy, fixed on the cracked plaster wall. "Willa and Weston. They're 5 and 7. A man, he took them. Said I wasn't fit. Said he had money, and I had nothing." Yates sat still, his hands resting on his knees. "Who was he?" "My husband. Used to be." Her voice cracked. "He beat me until I couldn't see straight, then told the court I was unstable. I tried to take the kids and run. He found me. I barely made it onto the train." "Did you tell the sheriff?" She shook her head. "He has money, friends. They don't believe women like me." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not alone anymore, Kala." She blinked fast. "Why do you care?" He stood, walked to the window, the glass fogged with morning frost. "Because I saw the way you dropped at that station, like you had carried the whole world on your back. No one should have to live like that." She was quiet a long time, then said, "I don't want to hide anymore." He turned. "Then don't." Her chin trembled. "What if he finds me again?" "Let him try." Days turned to weeks. Kala moved into a small room over the feed store, the walls papered with faded florals, the floor creaking under her steps. She helped out, sweeping and cleaning, in exchange for board. Yates came by often, bringing her apples, their skin speckled red, or a dog-eared book of poetry he'd found in the mercantile. He never made a fuss over it. She laughed for the first time when he tripped over a stray tabby cat in the alley behind the store, its fur matted with burrs. "You're not as tough as you look," she told him, grinning. "And you're tougher than you think," he shot back. She looked at him then, really looked. He was tall, sun-browned, with a quiet way about him, his eyes kind but sharp, like he saw everything and judged nothing. His hands, calloused from years of rope and rain, were steady when he passed her a canteen or brushed dirt from his coat. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet, she said, "Why are you still here?" Yates leaned on the porch rail beside her, the wood rough under his palms. "Because I want to be." She looked down at her hands, the scars on her wrists now faint as spiderwebs. "You don't even know me." He reached over, gently touched her fingers. "I know enough." She did not pull away. Neither of them said anything else, but from that night on, he held her hand whenever she let him. She never collapsed again, not once, but every time she stumbled, he was already there. The high summer heat came early that year, settling over the valley like a heavy quilt. Dust clung to every hem and collar, and the scent of cut hay drifted in from the fields west of town. Days stretched long and quiet, and Kala began to move through them with a steadier step. She had taken to walking the back trails near the river in the early mornings before the store opened, her boots crunching on gravel paths lined with cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The sound of water, soft over smooth stones, was quieter there, a balm to her frayed edges. She carried a borrowed satchel with bread, cheese, and a small tin of wild honey, and sometimes she sat near the bend where the deer came to drink, their hooves leaving delicate prints in the damp earth, letting the minutes pass without speaking to anyone. She found him there one morning, crouched beside the creek, coaxing a splinter from his palm with the tip of a pocket knife, its handle worn smooth from years of use. "You always this early?" she asked, not quite smiling but close. Yates looked up without surprise. "Only when the cattle don't need chasing." She set her satchel down and perched on a flat stone, its surface cool against her palms. "You working less now?" "No. Just earlier. Gives me time to think." She folded her hands in her lap. "About what?" He flicked the splinter into the water, watching the ripples spread. "What comes next?" She traced a line in the dirt with the toe of her boot. "I haven't let myself think that far." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Then let me ask you plain. You still planning to keep running?" Kala didn't answer at first. She watched the water catch the light, glinting like scattered coins. "I don't want to. But I don't know what staying looks like." Yates sat beside her, his shoulder close but not touching. "It could look like a job at the school. They're short a woman to help the younger ones. Miss Cartwright said something to me." Kala blinked. "She doesn't know me. She knows what you've done since you got here. I don't know anything about teaching. You know how to listen. That's more than most." She pulled her knees up, rested her chin on them. "What if I can't get my children back?" "I don't have an answer for that," he said. "But I know you'll never stop trying." They sat without speaking again until the sun crested the ridge, its light spilling gold across the valley. When she finally stood, she looked down at him. "I'll go see Miss Cartwright." He nodded once, and she walked back toward town, her shoulders straighter than they had been the day before, her shadow trailing long behind her. It was near the end of that week when she started at the schoolhouse, a one-room building with a bell that clanged off-key. The children were wary of her at first, quiet and curious, their eyes following her as she moved between desks. But Kala had a way of kneeling to their level, her voice soft as she asked their names, waiting, not pushing. By the end of the second day, one of the girls, a freckled child named Lila, left a blue ribbon on the chair, its edges frayed but carefully tied in a bow. Kala mentioned it to Yates that evening while they shelled peas outside the livery, the air thick with the scent of horses and fresh straw. "I used to braid Willa's hair with blue ribbons like that," she said, her fingers pausing on a pod. Yates didn't speak, just offered her another handful. She cracked one open, then said, "I wrote the court in Kansas City. Used a name they won't recognize." He glanced over. "You think they'll respond?" "I don't know. But if I don't ask, they never will." He reached into the basket, working quiet beside her. "You ever think about what you'd do if you did get them back?" She looked up at the sky, where the first stars had begun to show, faint pinpricks against the deepening blue. "I'd find a place with trees, something near water. Nothing big. Just somewhere they could run and not be afraid." Yates looked at her then, and something passed between them, unspoken but solid, a shared picture forming slowly. "I know a place like that," he said after a while. "It's got an old barn and a stream behind it. Land's been sitting quiet since old man Rourke passed." She turned to him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been thinking about what comes next too." The silence between them shifted, not heavy but full. Later that night, she stood at the edge of the boarding house porch, the wood creaking under her weight, while Yates saddled his mare, her coat gleaming under the lantern light. He paused before mounting. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Kala hesitated, then reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve, the fabric rough under her fingers. "I'm glad you stayed." He didn't move for a moment, then said, "So am I." She let her hand fall, and he rode off into the dark, the sound of hooves fading into the night. In her room, she unfolded the letter she had written but not yet sent. Her handwriting was careful, the paper creased from being taken out and read too many times. She added a line at the bottom, her pen scratching softly, I am building a home." Then she folded it again and walked it to the post office herself, the stars bright overhead. By late July, the valley grasses had browned at the edges, crisping under the weight of heat that settled without apology. The river had thinned, its waters running slow between sun-warmed stones. In the mornings, Kala still walked the quiet banks, but now she was not alone. The children from the schoolhouse had taken to trailing her, half curious, half attached, their laughter sharp and fleeting as birds. She let them, never chasing them off, though she said little. She had learned, even now, that silence could be a kind of invitation. That afternoon, she found Yates in the supply yard behind the blacksmith shop, stripping rust from the hinges of a broken gate, the air heavy with the tang of iron and coal smoke. "I got a letter," she said, her voice even. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "From Kansas?" She nodded. "They forwarded my petition to the county clerk. Said I'd need to appear in person if I wanted any claim considered." His jaw worked once, but he said only, "When?" "2 weeks." She stepped forward, glancing at the gate. "You fixing that for Heron?" Wasn't going to wait on him to do it. She crouched beside him, took up the sanded cloth from the dirt, and started on the other hinge, her movement steady. "I'll need someone to ride with me." He didn't answer right away, his eyes on her hands, now healed, though faint bruising still lingered beneath the surface, like shadows under water. "You sure you want to walk back into that place?" "I don't want to," she said, glancing at him. "But I can't leave them in his house. Not now that I'm stronger." He folded his legs beneath him, their knees nearly touching as they worked side by side. "Then I'll come." She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The next day, she borrowed a ledger from the schoolhouse, its pages yellowed and curling, and began copying down notes, legal terms, court instructions, names she remembered from the custody hearing, her handwriting cramped but deliberate. She didn't ask Yates to help her read through it, but when she paused to rest her eyes, he slid a rolled map toward her, the parchment worn soft at the edges. "This is the county line," he said, pointing to a faint ink line. "And this is where your husband's property sits, if it hasn't changed." She traced the ink with her finger. "You've been there?" "Drove cattle through years ago. I remember the place. Big white house, 2 gables, fence line was new then." Her mouth tightened. "That would be it." He watched her for a moment, then said, "You'll need a place to stay once we get there. You won't sleep under his roof." "You won't have to." She looked up. "You already planned this?" "I don't like leaving things to chance." She closed the ledger slowly. "You always that way?" "I've seen what happens when people aren't." The next week passed in a blur of preparation. She worked mornings at the schoolhouse, afternoons writing letters to anyone who might vouch for her. Miss Cartwright offered a character statement, her penmanship crisp and formal. Dr. Keller agreed to send a note west with them, confirming her injuries and her recovery, written on paper that smelled faintly of antiseptic. At sunset on the last evening before their departure, Kala sat on the porch of the feed store, her boots dusty, her skirt hem damp from the pump, the air heavy with the scent of grain and leather. "You ever think," she asked, "how strange it is that you found me at all?" Yates leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, his hat tilted back. "I think about it more than I say." She turned her face toward the street, where a wagon creaked past, its wheels groaning under the weight of grain sacks. "If you hadn't been there." "I was," he said, cutting her off, quiet but sure. She didn't speak for a while, then said, "I don't know what to do once I have them. I don't have land. I don't even have a horse of my own. You'll have what you need. I can't ask you to carry all this." "You didn't ask," he said, stepping down from the porch and turning toward the stables. "You just handed me half of it without realizing." She rose and followed him without a word. The cool air inside the stable smelled of leather, hay, and the faint musk of horses. His mare was already saddled, and beside her stood a smaller roan gelding, its coat brushed to a soft gleam, its eyes bright and alert. A riding skirt and coat, sturdy but finely stitched, were folded on the edge of the tack bench. "That's not mine," she said, eyeing the gear. "It is now," Yates said. "Figured you'd want to ride your own horse back." Her hands tightened at her sides, but she didn't speak. He stepped toward the door. "We leave at first light." She stood there a while longer, one hand resting on the gelding's withers, her throat too thick to speak. That night, she did not sleep much. The wind pushed against the shutters, and down the street, the saloon spilled late voices into the dust, their laughter sharp and fleeting. She lay still, eyes open, and thought of Willa's small hand inside hers, of Weston's laugh when he ran too fast and tripped over his own feet, his knees grass-stained and his smile wide. At dawn, she was waiting outside when Yates rode up, the sky pale and streaked with pink. "You ready?" he asked. She mounted without answering, her hands steady on the reins. They rode east, the sun rising slow behind them, casting their shadows long across the prairie. She did not look back. They rode through the low country, the land flattening by the second day into wide stretches of brittle grass and scattered cottonwoods, their leaves trembling in the wind. The air pressed everything forward, like breath held too long. Kala's thighs ached from the saddle, but she said nothing. Yates kept pace beside her, never rushing, never slowing unless she did first. By the third morning, dust clung to their clothes like a second skin, and the horizon shimmered with heat. They'd passed few travelers, and the ones they did gave only curt nods, their eyes lingering on Kala's borrowed coat, its buttons polished bone, and her jaw set sharp beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't flinch beneath their looks now, not anymore. They camped that night near a dry ravine, the fire low and close-walled with stone, its light flickering across their faces. Yates handed her a tin plate, the beans steaming faintly, and sat across from her, his boots stretched out toward the heat. "I thought I'd feel more afraid," she said, pulling apart a biscuit with her fingers, its edges crumbling. "Coming back?" She nodded, her eyes on the fire. "Because I'm not alone this time." Yates didn't answer. He folded his arms across his knees and watched the flames, the silence between them no longer empty but warm, like the embers glowing at the fire's heart. She leaned back, resting her shoulders against the saddlebag, the leather worn soft from use. "What made you stay in Montana? You ever think about leaving?" "I did once," he said. "After my father died, thought I'd head south, maybe see San Antonio. But I couldn't leave Ma to run the place alone. And then the herd grew, and the land got into my bones." "You still have family there?" "Just my mother. She remarried last spring, moved north to live with my aunt. Said she was tired of watching the same sun rise over the same hills." Kala pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "I never had much of a place that felt like mine. Just rooms I passed through. You'll have one." She looked across the fire at him. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and the faint howl of a coyote in the distance. She watched him a long moment, then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded cloth, its edges frayed. She passed it to him without a word. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a faded ribbon, once pink, now nearly white, its weave soft from years of handling. Her fingers twitched once as she let it go. "Willa wore that the day I took them," she said. She dropped it in the wagon. "I didn't realize I'd kept it until weeks later." Yates laid the ribbon across his palm, then folded it again, slow and careful, and handed it back. "You'll put it in her hair again." Kala didn't speak. She tucked it away and lay back on the bedroll, her eyes open to the stars, their light sharp and unyielding against the vast dark. They reached Kansas City 2 days later, the town a sprawl of wood and brick, the streets loud with wagons, the clang of rail cars, and the shouts of vendors hawking wares. Kala kept her hat pulled low, her coat buttoned, the collar brushing her chin. She walked beside Yates with her shoulders squared, not once reaching for his arm, though he stayed close enough to touch. The boarding house sat near the edge of the warehouse district, a modest two-story with thin curtains and a half-painted porch, its green paint peeling in strips. The landlady, a woman with a sharp nose and gray hair pinned tight, gave them a room with 2 cots and a basin of clean water, its surface rippling in the draft. She didn't ask questions. Kala stood at the window once the door shut behind them, the glass smudged with fingerprints. The courthouse is 4 blocks from here. We'll go first thing. She turned to him. I don't want you in the room. Not unless they ask. Yates nodded. I'll wait outside. She hesitated. It's not because I don't want you there. I know. Then why aren't you arguing? Because you already decided. She gave a short breath, something like a laugh, and sat on the edge of the cot, its springs creaking. It's strange. I thought if I ever came back here, I'd feel like I was drowning. But right now, I just feel ready. Yates leaned against the wall, arms folded. You've already done the hardest part. She looked up. Which is? Living through it. The next morning, she wore the same riding skirt but pinned her hair back tighter, neater, a single braid coiled at the nape of her neck. She didn't speak as they walked to the courthouse, its stone steps worn smooth by years of boots. He waited on the steps while she climbed them alone, her back straight, her hands still. It was nearly noon when the door opened. She stepped outside, blinking against the light, and walked to him without stopping, her face unreadable. They agreed to reopen the petition, she said. I have to prove I can support them. Show I have a home, income, a stable place. That's something the judge said. I'll need an affidavit from the person I live with, someone who can speak to my character, my work. Yates met her eyes. Then I'll give it. She pressed her lips together. It'll mean tying your name to mine. In writing. I don't care about names. She shook her head. This isn't a favor. I know that. She looked down at the folded paper in her hand, its edges creased. They'll send someone to verify it all. I have a month to prepare. Yates didn't hesitate. Then we'd better be home before fall. Home, she said quietly. He reached out, not touching her but close. That place I told you about, the one near the stream? It needs someone who knows how to start again. She smiled then, not wide, just enough, the corners of her mouth softening. That someone might be me. They didn't speak again until they stood at the edge of the rail yard, horses saddled, dust rising around them in the late afternoon heat. Kala turned to Yates, her voice low. I want them to grow up knowing what it means to be safe. To be loved without cost. He met her gaze. Then let's build them a life where that's all they'll ever know. She nodded once, climbed into the saddle, and didn't look back as they rode west, not because she was afraid, but because everything she needed was already riding beside her. They returned to Montana in the soft curve of late August, when the shadows stretched longer and the heat began to loosen its grip on the land. The journey back had been quiet, not from weariness but from something settled between them, a quiet certainty that didn't need tending with words. As they crested the ridge that overlooked the valley west of Red Rock, Kala slowed her gelding and looked down at the parcel of land nestled between the cottonwoods and the slow bend of the creek. The roof of the old Rourke cabin was dappled with rust where the tin had weathered, but the porch still stood, its posts carved with faint initials from years past. The barn leaned steady against the wind, its walls grayed but solid. This it? She asked, her voice low. Yates nodded. It'll need work. Roof leaks in 2 places. Fencing's gone soft along the northern edge. She turned to him. Are we buying it or borrowing it? It's yours. Deed was transferred last week. I put it in your name. She blinked once, lips parted. Why? Because you can't build something real standing on someone else's land. Her hands tightened on the reins, the leather creaking. Yates, that's not. I know it's more than you asked for, he interrupted gently, but it's not more than you deserve. She looked away quickly, then back toward the cabin, its windows catching the late sun. I don't know how to repay something like that. You don't, he said. You just live in it. They spent the next weeks putting the place to rights. She sanded the raw boards of the porch with her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her hands steady now, the skin smooth where bruises had once been. He patched the roof with fresh tin and mended the barn doors with lengths of pine that smelled of resin. Miss Cartwright sent over a small cast-iron stove, its surface polished to a dull shine. Dr. Keller stopped by with a parcel of dried herbs, lavender and chamomile, and a worn quilt his sister had left behind before moving east, its patches stitched in shades of blue and ochre. Each evening, they sat on the front steps and watched the sky darken over the ridge, the stars emerging one by one. Some nights they spoke, of the land or the weather, other nights they didn't, but he always handed her a cup of hot chicory, its bitterness softened with a spoonful of honey, and she always drank it slow, her fingers brushing his when she passed it back. One afternoon, just before the first frost, a letter arrived. Kala stood beneath the eaves, the envelope in her hand, her thumb pressed to the seal, its wax cracked but intact. Yates stepped down from the ladder, where he'd been nailing a loose board, and wiped his hands on his trousers. Is it from Kansas? She nodded once, then opened it. Her eyes scanned the page, her mouth set in a hard line that softened as she read. When she looked up, her voice was steady. The court ruled in my favor. The children are being escorted by a matron. They'll arrive next week. Yates didn't ask if she was ready. He only said, we'll ride to meet them. The train pulled in under a sky heavy with gray, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Kala stood stiff beside Yates, her gloves clutched in one hand, the other pressed tight to her ribs, where her heart beat too fast. When the door opened and a thin woman stepped down, guiding two children ahead of her, Kala didn't move at first. Willa looked smaller than she remembered, her hair cropped shorter, a patch sewn into the hem of her dress, the fabric faded but clean. Weston clung to the matron's skirt, his eyes wide and uncertain, his boots scuffed at the toes. Then Willa's gaze lifted and caught hers. One breath, then another. Ma. Kala dropped the gloves, her knees hitting the platform as her arms opened. Willa ran first, her face crumpling as she crashed into her mother's chest. Weston followed a heartbeat later, stumbling into the circle of her arms, his small hands clutching her shawl. She held them close, her shoulders shaking, one hand tangled in Willa's hair, the other pressed to Weston's back. I'm here, she whispered, over and over. I'm here, I'm here. The matron stepped back with a nod toward Yates, who tipped his hat in silent thanks, his eyes soft but steady. They rode home in the wagon Yates had borrowed from town, its wheels creaking over the rutted road. Willa sat beside Kala, her head resting against her mother's arm, her fingers tracing the stitches on Kala's sleeve. Weston dozed in her lap, one hand curled into her shawl, his breath warm against her collarbone. When they reached the cabin, Yates lifted Weston gently, carrying him inside, his small form limp with sleep. Kala followed with Willa at her side, showing her where the stove sat, its warmth radiating through the room, where her quilt was folded, its colors soft in the lamplight, where the light pulled warmest in the corner by the window. That night, she tucked them into the small bed, kissing their foreheads with a hand that didn't shake, the ribbon from her saddlebag now tied gently in Willa's hair. When she stepped onto the porch, Yates stood waiting, arms folded loosely, eyes on the stars, their light faint through the gathering clouds. She stopped in front of him. I don't know how to name what you've given me. He looked at her, the lantern light catching the lines beside his mouth, etched deep from years of sun and wind. Don't name it. Just live it. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. I want you to stay. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said, his voice low, rough with something unspoken. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, the brim of his hat brushing her hair. "I don't just want a roof or a field or a fence that holds. I want you beside me when I wake. I want something that doesn't fade when the hard seasons come." His thumb brushed her cheekbone, slow and careful. "Then that's what we'll build." They didn't kiss right away. They stood pressed close, the moment stretching between them like breath held warm between two bodies. When she finally rose on her toes and touched her mouth to his, it was quiet, sure, and lasting, like the creek that ran steady behind the cabin. The morning after the first snow, Willa stood barefoot on the porch, her breath clouding in the cold, watching the sun rise over the hills, its light soft and pink against the fresh snow. Kala wrapped her arms around the girl from behind, resting her chin on her daughter's shoulder, the quilt draped over both of them. Inside, Yates stirred the fire, the logs crackling, while Weston sat half asleep in his lap, his small hands clutching a tin mug of warm milk. The cabin smelled of cedar and ash and something sweet rising in the iron pot on the stove, a loaf of cornbread baking slow. Outside, the land was still but not silent, the creek moving beneath its thin skin of ice, birds shifting in the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Kala turned to the door and looked back once at the land that was theirs now, not borrowed, not promised, simply theirs. Then she stepped inside, into the warmth, into the life they'd made together.